All right, guys, it is crossover Monday where I am the host of Locked On Falcons, Aaron Freeman, joined by the Locked On Colts host, Evan Sidery. And today we are crossing over to talk about the big trade between the Atlanta Falcons and Indianapolis Colts for quarterback Matt Ryan.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Rock Auto, where you can find amazing selection, reliably low prices, and all the parts your car will ever need. Just visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. So, guys, before we get into today's crossover with Evan Sidery, the host of Locked On Colts, I do want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Colts is also free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, you can find Locked On Falcons also on YouTube. And make sure you give us a like when you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons podcast. So we will get into the ins and outs of this trade from both teams' sides, the Falcons and Colts, with Evan Sidery on this sort of mini crossover, off-season crossover today. But before we get into all of that, I do kind of want to go a little bit on a little bit of a rant about this trade, which is what most of you are tuning in for. So, you got to give the people what they want. But, this is a terrible trade, right? The Falcons giving up a third-round pick, or getting a third-round pick back for Matt Ryan, I think the 82nd overall pick. So the lesser of the two Colts third-round picks that they got is an awful trade. And it's tough because, we can talk about, what Matt Ryan meant for the organization and whatnot. But we kind of knew, 24 hours ago that, this potential move was possible. But for the team to basically get pennies on a dollar is certainly not something that bodes well for their ability to maximize this football team moving forward. And you know me, I'm never going to stop anybody from complaining about the Falcons when basically all I do for a living is complain about the Falcons. But it's hard for me to see Falcon fans also sort of praising this regime. Again, I'm not trying to sit here and be like they're the worst ever. But even Monday, as we're waiting for the Matt Ryan news to break, I'm seeing people be like, "Oh, outside of the whole Deshaun Watson debacle, I'm actually loving all the moves that Terry Fontenot and the company and I don't understand why there's always this rush for people to praise this regime when they have done pretty much nothing in the last year that is really warranting praise. You can pick out a couple of things here or there or whatever the case may be. Casey Hayward, that's a good signing. All right, cool. We got a decent CB2. Congratulations. You're doing a great job. So I just I don't get that element of it. And so we'll see what this team does moving forward. Obviously, they picked up Marcus Mariota, signed him to a 2-year contract. He's going to be their bridge to wherever. Matt Ryan was their previous bridge. They got a lesser bridge. This one's made out of wooden planks instead of bricks, I guess you could say. No offense to Marcus Mariota. He's perfectly fine, competent NFL starting quarterback, perfectly league average player. And, goes back to the point I've made several times on the podcast where you're probably going to get close to league average play for a fraction of the price that you're paying Matt Ryan. So from that standpoint, cool, awesome. But we're going to sit here and wait to see what this regime does as far as the quarterback situation. And frankly, nothing they've shown so far tells you that there's a plan. And this goes back to the conversation you heard me have a year ago, where it's is there a plan, or are they just making up as they go? And clearly, if you needed further evidence that they're just kind of making it up, then I think today's news of Matt Ryan being traded for a third-round pick is that. So, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Most teams are just kind of making it up. The Colts are making it up as they go. 3 days ago, did they think they were getting Matt Ryan? No, but some teams are just better at landing on their feet, so to speak, than other teams. The Falcons don't appear to be one of those teams moving forward, and we'll just sort of have to wait and see if they can kind of luck into a quarterback, which sounds worse than what it is. but like that's how it is. Like they lucked into Matt Ryan, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that they could stumble into and find themselves falling onto a franchise quarterback in the near future. It's not impossible. Like as I said, Matt Ryan they kind of lucked into because Bill Parcells, being the general manager of the Dolphins, who had the number one pick that year, because he has these sort of strict rules about what he values in a quarterback. Matt Ryan didn't necessarily pass that filter, and they passed on Matt Ryan, took Jake Long, and Matt Ryan fell to the Falcons at 3, and the rest is history. So it's not to sit here and say that the sky's falling, everything's doomed and gloom. The Falcons can't figure out a way to quote unquote rise up out of this situation in the future. But certainly, I think today, basically getting pennies on the dollar for trading your franchise quarterback does not fill you with a lot of hope and optimism for the future direction of this team. And it just gets back to something you've heard me talk about on this podcast for a year now. Like, I just don't understand why so many people are quick to want to put a positive spin on this regime and act like they're really good at their jobs. And it's just like, what have they done? Like, what have they done that says to you that they're doing a good job, that they're doing a great job, that this team is headed in the right direction? Again, they doesn't necessarily mean that they're headed in the wrong direction. Although, again, saying things like that seems a little tough. Or that's a tough pill to swallow. I don't think anybody's buying that on today of all days, but it's just like one of those things where I don't get it. But I will leave that there, and we will continue today's Locked On Falcons, Locked On Colts crossover with Evan Sidery to get his thoughts on this trade, as well as sort of get into the ins and outs of what this trade means for both teams, including the Falcons, and why the Falcons didn't necessarily get maximum leverage and all that various stuff as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, always want to plug, the fellow Locked On Atlanta Sports podcast, and why not plug the Locked On Bulldogs podcast and what Clint and Daniel are doing over there, keeping you guys up to date as the Georgia spring game is coming up and what's at stake for this upcoming Georgia team to repeat as national champions. So find the Locked On Bulldogs podcast on the same podcast platforms you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So we know that the NCAA tournament is ongoing, and I'm sure many of you guys have had your brackets already busted, but you don't have to worry. You can earn some cash back by going to betonline.net, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info, and you can enter their $100,000 Sweet 16 bracket contest where there will be hundreds of winners. You can be one of them, and you can win prizes up to $25,000. That goes to the top person who wins that contest, $25,000. And whether you're into March Madness, BetOnline still has you covered for NBA, boxing, UFC, golf, esports, hockey, and your favorite Vegas casino games. Even if you want to lay some draft props on where Malik Willis might get drafted, you can do that at betonline.net. So head on over to the website, use your mobile device to sign up today so that you can learn more about the latest trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, Evan, this is a pretty big day, but I'm sure you're probably used to it because the Colts seem to be always trading or acquiring a new quarterback every single offseason. And, it's been a long time for at least Falcons fans in terms of, having to make a change at the quarterback position. But, give your expectation and your side of it from that perspective with the Colts.
Yeah, so it all started really early Monday morning when we saw Ian Rappaport tweet out that the Falcons were fielding calls about Matt Ryan. And pretty quickly, we just heard Colts all morning. And then it happened there with Jake Glazer mentioning that the Matt Ryan trade went down for a third-round pick, number 82 overall. And from the Colts side of things, Aaron, I think it's a home run. I mean, what they gave up for Carson Wentz, obviously a first-round pick in this year's draft, is tough to swallow. But the way that Chris Ballard's kind of maneuvered out of the Carson Wentz fiasco, getting a third-round pick from Washington, moving up in the third round, moved up in the second round in this year as well, got a future pick in next year's draft. So they pretty much swapped out Carson Wentz and Matt Ryan for free, and it's an upgrade. I mean, you know as well as anyone how good and underrated Matt Ryan can be. I think within the Colts offense, it's a home run fit. From the Falcons side of things, though, Aaron, it's kind of sad because it feels like this relationship kind of just fizzled out a little bit between Ryan and the Falcons over the last week.
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster for a week for Falcons because they were all in on Deshaun Watson. Seemed like they were about to get him. And that sort of led to this, divorce between Matt Ryan and the Atlanta Falcons, because it seemed like a week ago, before all this sort of Deshaun Watson stuff broke on, I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday night. I can't recall specifically. It's all been a blur. But it would seem like a week ago that Matt Ryan was going to be the Atlanta Falcons quarterback, and maybe they would draft a quarterback this year with an idea towards, the succession, and sort of figure it out in the future beyond that year. And then, very quickly things kind of derailed, and now you're leading to Matt Ryan being gone, and you're trading him for a fraction of the price that you potentially thought. Going into this trade, I was like, oh, they'll get, probably, if they go to a team like the Colts, which seemed to make the most sense, they might be able to get the Colts second round pick this year and maybe a high pick next year. And for them to basically settle for the lesser of the two Colts third round picks feels like a massive disappointment. And you lose your franchise leader for basically, you're just kind of throwing away for literal pennies on the dollar. So it's an all in all rough day for the Falcons, because you're not only losing, one of the top players that's ever played for this organization, a player that's brought stability to this organization for 14 years, brought it out of there. But you're also not really getting any value back on that. And it just feels like the Falcons are kind of flailing in the wind right now as an organization.
Yeah, it's really intriguing just how the Ryan trade happened. Number 82 overall, the Colts kept the Washington pick, number 73 overall. We saw, like I mentioned earlier, Carson Wentz getting traded for more than that, Aaron. So why do you think the Falcons settled on the price for Matt Ryan? I feel like they could have gotten more, like you mentioned. I thought it would have been the higher third-round pick, at least from the Colts, or maybe they throw in a future third-round pick in next year's draft or something along those lines. But it's stunning to me just thinking about how Carson Wentz somehow has more value than Matt Ryan.
Yeah, it's kind of bizarre, and I guess we'll probably find out more information on exactly how this thing went down and how it got negotiated in the coming days and whatnot. But one of the things I kind of opined over the weekend on Locked On Falcons was, did the whole failure to get Deshaun Watson kind of ruin the Falcons' ability to get leverage in a trade, where basically a team like the Colts knew that there weren't that many teams out there that would be bidding against them, and certainly if the Falcons were open to the idea of trading Matt Ryan, they'd probably ideally like to trade him to the AFC, so he wouldn't be an obstacle in their own future to get to the playoffs and potentially the Super Bowl down the road, which seems very far away at this point in time. But I think the Colts kind of knew that they kind of had the Falcons by the shirt and curlies, as they say, and therefore could kind of lowball them in an offer, because you knew that this was headed to a divorce, and the Falcons had a ticking clock on Monday, where they needed to, if they were going to move Matt Ryan, they needed to move him today, because they had a roster bonus due tomorrow that would have made it virtually impossible to gain any sort of cap space by trading Matt Ryan. By trading him now, they do save about $8 million against the salary cap, but they are taking on a $40 million dead money hit, which is got to be the largest in NFL history. I think the Eagles took on like 33 when they traded Wentz last year. And I think you couple Matt Ryan along with Julio Jones and a couple of other players, I believe the number is $62 million in dead money this year, where I'm pretty certain that is the biggest in NFL history. So the Falcons are basically going to take a massive loss this year to sort of reset their salary cap situation in the future. So that's a bright side. But if you're, no offense to Marcus Mariota, but I don't know if he's the guy that you want to hit your wagons to rebuilding this thing in the future.
One last point I had before we dive in, I wanted to get your thoughts really on the Falcons for the next few minutes before we dive over to the Colts, closing out the show, Aaron. But one last thing on the Matt Ryan trade and just the compensation structure I wanted to hit on. When you see Matt Ryan as far as like his tier quarterback nowadays, obviously the MVP in 2016, for Colts fans that are wondering about Matt Ryan and thinking, oh, this is Phillip Rivers all over again, he doesn't have an arm anymore. I've watched some Matt Ryan games today. I've watched some highlights from last year. He still definitely has some juice left in his arm, Aaron. Just for those wondering out there that haven't watched a lot of Matt Ryan, what's your overall opinion of Matt Ryan as a quarterback and where he currently ranks in the tier of the NFL?
Yeah, he's not really a guy that's going to sort of put a team on his back and go out there and win you games. But if you put talent around him, he's basically, it's a pejorative term in a lot of circles, but like he's the ultimate game manager, right? If you put talent around him, and I think the Colts really have that situation for him, like he can be that sort of ball distributor, if you want to liken it to an NBA point guard, that if he has those shooters on the wings and the score in the low post, he can distribute the ball. He's the type of guy that can get you, to use that basketball analogy, like 15 assists a night, and that's really what he is at this point in time. So when you look back at Matt Ryan these last couple of years in Atlanta, the biggest criticism I've had for him on his play on the football field has been mostly about his ability to deal with pressure. And that has been up and down at various points, and the Falcons have dealt with some really bad offensive lines the last couple of years. This past year was the worst of the group, and he actually was better this year handling pressure than he was in previous years, and playing behind a Colts offensive line that I know didn't necessarily live up to these expectations a year ago, but certainly has the reputation of being one of the best offensive lines in the league. I think that's a really great marriage for Matt Ryan, and handing the ball off to Jonathan Taylor and not having to sort of have to be the guy that makes the offense engine go. And given some of the weapons that the Colts do have, I think they have enough talent there to really maximize Matt Ryan's skill set. So I do feel like if Colts fans have a little bit of trepidation about Matt Ryan, like I wouldn't sit here and tell you that if he gets into a shootout with Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, he's going to outduel those guys. But I certainly think if the Colts can get into a situation where, the rest of the team can keep, a lid on some of these other top AFC quarterbacks, that if you need Matt Ryan to be able to make the throws necessary to win a football game, he's certainly capable of doing that.
Let's go ahead and dive into the Atlanta angle, Aaron, because I'm just curious. I'll just give you the floor here mostly because 14 years Matt Ryan was at Atlanta, was a living legend for the organization, probably the best quarterback of all time. You'll be covering all week on Locked On Falcons, I assume, as well, Aaron. But what's your overall opinion seeing the official trade happen where Matt Ryan is no longer the Falcons quarterback after he's been there since 2008?
Yeah, I mean, if this is something I've been talking about on Locked On Falcons for over a year, that it seemed like the end was near. We're getting closer to the end, but you figured it would go out with a little bit more fanfare. It would go out with like, okay, this is clearly the plan and the path forward, where it's like we draft Matt Ryan's heir apparent. Similar to kind of the situation you saw with the 49ers last year when they drafted Trey Lance and still had Jimmy Garoppolo, where it's like, okay, Jimmy's going to be the quarterback this year, but then we're going to turn the keys to Trey Lance in the future. And sort of that's what I've been envisioning for this Falcon team the last year or so. And so for it to all kind of just blow up now and just kind of fall apart is frustrating at this point in time. But when you look at Matt Ryan's legacy, again, it's hard to put it in words because the Falcons just have not been a great organization for most of their 50-plus year history. And there was a long time, as Falcon fans call it, a curse, where the team was unable to win, have winning seasons in back-to-back years. And that all changed in the first 2 years that Matt Ryan was in Atlanta. They had existed since 1966, and that curse existed for over 40 years, as they say. And that broke with Matt Ryan in his first 2 seasons. And that's sort of kind of the legacy of Matt Ryan brings to the table, where you just got consistency, you got steadiness, you got a guy that was, the face of your franchise. You never had to worry about Matt Ryan saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or anything like that. And now the Falcons are kind of thrown into turmoil now without him being that guy and without having a clear direction. And so it's tough to sort of see what the path forward for this team is. But certainly, it's nice to see Matt Ryan not have to, mire in obscurity here in Atlanta and gets an opportunity to get back to the postseason with the Colts moving forward.
You had great thoughts on this, Aaron, last week. Just as you were covering the whole Deshaun Watson situation, that kind of came out of nowhere, where it seemed like Watson might be going to Atlanta, and then last minute he pivots to the Browns. But what was your overall thinking of the handling from the Falcons side of things with the situation with Deshaun Watson? For those who haven't listened to your podcast yet, about that with the Matt Ryan angle, where Matt Ryan never did anything wrong, but they kind of approached the Deshaun Watson situation, shot their Hail Mary, and it kind of all blew up in their face there in the end.
Yeah, it's, we talk about Matt Ryan being sort of this unproblematic face of your franchise. And then, looking at someone like Deshaun Watson, given sort of the off-field situation he's dealing with 22 active civil suits against him for sexual misconduct, and sort of that guy potentially being the face of your franchise. And that feels like such a switch for this organization that really, since the whole Michael Vick situation went down over 15 years ago, that they have sort of prided themselves on having high character guys so that they would never be embarrassed as they were in the organization, like they were 15 years ago when Michael Vick was in prison for dogfighting. So watching that whole situation go down, it was kind of bizarre to see the Falcons sort of essentially get into bed with Deshaun Watson. And it is understandable given the talent. I know Colts fans are well aware of the type of player that he is and the potential that he brings on the football field. But given this team's circumstance over the last 15 years, getting into bed with a player that had some of those off-field question marks made it, head scratching to a certain extent. And then what that meant was it was very clear that the Falcons were, out on Matt Ryan, which again, not a total surprise that the Falcons were looking to move on from Matt Ryan, but you figured there was kind of going to be a plan in place, and this whole, Deshaun Watson's situation just kind of came out of nowhere, came out of left field, and all got kind of rushed together, and it sort of left people like myself, with our head swimming, trying to figure out, okay, what's going on, and then sort of, that all sort of culminates in today's move. So it's been a tough couple of days for the Falcons. It feels like, they've gotten finessed a couple of times by other teams and other general managers.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting time in Atlanta. And I wanted to ask about the direction of this team moving forward here, Aaron, because we already saw the domino fall after the Matt Ryan trade. Marcus Mariota reunites with Arthur Smith on a 2-year deal. Presumably will be the bridge starter for the Falcons if they do indeed draft a quarterback this year. Do you think that's the play moving forward here, Dan? I mean, that's what I assume immediately after signing Mariota and getting rid of Ryan, is that they like a guy in this year's draft, whether it be Malik Willis, Kenny Pickett, one of those guys. And I would assume that's the direction they probably go. And what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, their general manager was at Pitt's pro day on Monday to watch Kenny Pickett. I'm sure he will be well traveled over the next couple of days, as a number of these other top quarterbacks in this upcoming 2022 draft work out at their various pro days. Obviously, I think there's going to be a lot of connections between the Falcons and Malik Willis, who is an Atlanta native. And so it makes a lot of sense if they were looking for a marketable quarterback in Deshaun Watson that's local. Certainly Malik Willis also checks those boxes and certainly doesn't have necessarily the off-field question marks that Deshaun Watson has. So he even checks better boxes in that regard. So I think you're going to hear a lot of connections between those two parties over the next, 4 or 5 weeks that we have between now and the draft. So it seems likely that the Falcons are going to take a quarterback. The question is when. Is that at the 8th overall selection? Do they sort of like somebody else and wait until round 2 to see if that guy falls to them, where they're now picking at 43 at the top of the second round, or whatever the case may be? So that's going to be probably the thing that, hangs over the rest of this offseason is, who's going to be the future quarterback, or do they decide to punt on the position altogether and just wait till next year in the 2023 draft, where a lot of people think it is going to be a much better draft class, and sort of, potentially kind of pull what the Dolphins did a couple of years ago and tank, but not really tank, but, just kind of like, we'll figure it out next year and we'll get our guy next year. So those are all going to be options on the table, and certainly we'll keep you covered on that in terms of Locked On Falcons. So we're going to flip sides and talk a little bit more about this trade from the Colts angle and what Matt Ryan is bringing to that Colts team and their direction moving forward. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL podcast, where you can find all the latest going on around the league outside of the cities of Atlanta and Indianapolis, aka Naptown. And so you can subscribe to Locked On NFL on your favorite podcast platform, including on YouTube. So I want to let you guys know that today's episode is also brought to you by Rock Auto. With ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer when you already have a computer with access to rockauto.com at home or in your pocket? Save time and money when using Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts that you could get at a chain store or car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years with reliably low prices for every customer. They have everything you need, from brake parts to tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now and browse their easy-to-use website, and you can see all the parts available for your car or truck, and then write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll go ahead now and dive over to the Colts side of things, Aaron. And at least my immediate reaction was it's a huge win for the Colts getting Matt Ryan and getting him on board as an upgrade over Carson Wentz. What was your opinion of Matt Ryan going to the Colts as far as scheme fit goes? Frank Reich's offense, I think he's a perfect fit in that offense. He has Jonathan Taylor. He has an offensive line. I think they'll add more playmakers to that. Michael Pittman on the outside, probably get another one in the draft as well. What's your overall opinion of Matt Ryan going to Indy and the fit there?
Yeah, sort of opining on where Matt Ryan could go in the last couple of days on Locked On Falcons, it seemed like the Colts and maybe the Eagles would be the best opportunities for Matt Ryan because you would get a good offensive line in both of those places. You would have teams that were more about running the football, teams that could play good defense and not have to force Matt Ryan to have to get into these, shootouts where he has to drop back and throw the ball 40, 50 times in order for the team to win, which has been the case far too often for the Falcons these last couple of years. So I love the fit for Matt Ryan in Indianapolis. As I said, I feel like he can be the guy that can, make that offense go much better than Carson Wentz did. Certainly, I think there's room for debate on Matt Ryan versus Phillip Rivers, but certainly I think Matt Ryan could come out ahead in that regard. The only thing that I would warn Colts fans about that would give me a little bit of pause about having too high of expectations with Matt Ryan in the immediate future is, historically speaking, these last couple of years with a lot of different offensive coordinator changes, he tends to have an up and down first year with a new offense, and then everything clicks for him in year two, and that was one of the things that Falcon fans were optimistic about after sort of a rough first year under Arthur Smith, that in year two, with a more developed Kyle Pitts and maybe adding some other weapons around, that maybe we could see Matt Ryan play at another high level. So I wouldn't necessarily expect, if I'm a Colts fan, Matt Ryan to hit the ground running based off of that recent history. But as you get more geared into things, I feel like he'll be a bright spot for that offense.
Thinking just about Falcons teams in the past, Aaron, and thinking what the Colts had with Taylor, the offensive line, a top 10 defense, is there any teams you can think back to for Matt Ryan where he's stepping into a similar situation? Like, is there a Falcons team from a couple of years ago? Was it the Super Bowl team or even maybe earlier and later than that where this is set up well for him to succeed?
Yeah, I think that Super Bowl team probably is the best example because they had a healthy running game. That's something that Matt Ryan really hasn't had throughout most of his career in Atlanta, outside of the first couple of years with Michael Turner as the Falcons running back. But then it wasn't as if their passing attack was as potent. Then it was Roddy White and Tony Gonzalez, which was a very solid, sort of 1-2 punch in that passing game. But obviously, with the addition of Julio Jones later on, you saw a little bit more of that explosive, dynamic playmaker in that passing game. So I feel like that probably that 2016 Super Bowl team, where it was helmed by running backs like Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman. Neither one of those guys are as good as Jonathan Taylor, but maybe combined, they might give you sort of what Jonathan Taylor gave to that Colts offense a year ago. And I feel like with some of the weapons that the Colts have, and probably, I don't, you would have to tell me, I know Jack Doyle retired. So,
Yeah.
probably getting a tight end probably helps because Matt Ryan's kind of always been better when he has that sort of reliable outlet in the passing game over the middle with a tight end like that. So I don't know if Mo Alley Cox is back or whatever the case may be, but certainly I think that would be something that the Colts may be interested in adding this offseason.
Yeah, Molly Cox did re-sign on a 3-year deal recently, and I think the draft is a very good idea as well because Chris Bowers mentioned they need a field stretching tight end. This is a very good draft class for that on day two. So I would not be shocked at all if the Colts drafted a tight end. But last few points here, Aaron. I appreciate the time for our crossover special today. Locked on Colts, Locked on Falcons. Go over this Matt Ryan trade. Julio Jones, just real quick, because I've seen a lot of Colts fans on Twitter asking about this idea. What's your opinion of Matt Ryan and Julio reuniting in Indy?
I mean, I would love to see it. Just as a fan, I don't, in terms of the viability of it, I have no idea. Um, yeah, I wouldn't even begin to opine on how likely it is to happen, but certainly I would love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see the Colts have a wide receiver need. I know Colts fans are saying just run it back now with Matt Ryan and Julio Jones from Atlanta to Indianapolis. But last point here, Aaron, appreciate the time as always. Just your overall opinion of this Matt Ryan trade. What's next for both sides? I think from the Colts side, they're going forward in the AFC South. The Falcons seem like they're kind of looking towards 2023 and beyond. Kind of just seems like two teams going the opposite directions here, making this trade today.
Yeah. I think you got to give kudos to Chris Ballard and company for turning a tough situation with how the Colts season ended with Carson Wentz into a very positive thing with Matt Ryan moving forward, and not really having to give up an arm and a leg like they did a year ago to acquire Carson Wentz in that. So it seems like the Colts were able to really sort of rescue that situation the best that they could, and the Falcons seemingly in the opposite direction, kind of bungled their situation to the best of their ability or the worst of their ability. So we'll just sort of have to see how the Falcons figure this thing out. But certainly, I think, they're clearly in a rebuild, and we'll just sort of have to see if, they can get this thing back on tracks sooner versus later. But sitting here today, I'm not filled with too much optimism that we're going to see this Falcon team, in the postseason in the near future.
Great stuff there, Aaron. Really appreciate it. Colts fans listening, go ahead and follow the Locked On Falcons podcast. You can follow Aaron on Twitter as well at Falc fans. For those Falcons fans listening, you can follow me over on Twitter at Locked On Colts. We give Colts insight. If you want to come on the bandwagon with Matt Ryan coming into the Colts, you can always come over there. So, Aaron, appreciate the time today, man. It's a lot of fun, and it definitely a huge domino that fell on Monday morning.
Absolutely. Look forward to seeing Matt Ryan play at a high level in a blue and white uniform instead of red and black.
Appreciate it.
So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on this Locked On crossover. We'll obviously have more insight into this and the direction of the Falcons as we unwrap this week, and we will revisit sort of the point that kind of led to the train being derailed by talking about the Falcons' pursuit of Deshaun Watson, which is is not as simple as turning the page on this and whatnot. So we'll get into that later on this week. But that's what's in store for you on Locked On Falcons. Of course, I'm always open for your feedback. If you want to rant at me, if you want to tell me why I'm an idiot, why I'm right, whatever the case may be, you can always hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And guys, I always like to recommend what your second listen should be, in addition to Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Colts, to get that angle on things. Why not check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, where Ryan Tracy and Eric Crocker will give you the lowdown on how all these free agent moves are impacting the top of the 2022 draft. And certainly, I'm sure they will have some thoughts on what the Falcons could do with that 8th overall selection now that Matt Ryan is no longer with the Atlanta Falcons. And you can check out Locked On NFL Draft podcast on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube.